The Last Sparring Session. Part 1. The morning before everything changed. The backyard in Culver City was not large. It was the backyard of a house on Roscomare Road that Bruce Lee had rented in 1968. A standard suburban yard, not quite half an acre, with a wooden fence on 3 sides, a tool shed against the east wall, and a concrete pad in the center that Lee had installed specifically for training, which meant for the 2 years between 1968 and 1970, it had been the site of the most consistently productive martial arts exchange Chuck Norris had ever participated in. He arrived at 7:15 on a Thursday morning in October 1969, which was his habitual time, early enough to find the yard already in use, because Bruce Lee did not start his mornings at 7:15, but somewhere closer to 5, which meant that when Chuck arrived, the concrete pad was already damp with the morning's previous work, and the equipment along the east fence carried the evidence of an hour already completed. Lee was shadowboxing in the corner when Chuck came through the gate. Not the formal shadowboxing of a training session, but the looser version, the kind that is a form of thinking rather than exercise, the body moving while the mind processes something other than the movement. He registered Chuck's arrival without stopping, completed the sequence he was in the middle of, and then stood still and looked at Chuck with the specific quality of attention he brought to things he was genuinely interested in, which was most things, but especially people. "You're early," he said. 7:15 is not early, Chuck said. "For you it's early," Lee said. He was already in training clothes, the same simple gray he always wore, the clothes of someone who had stopped caring about what training looks like and was only interested in what training is. "You're usually 7:20, 7:22. He paused. "Something on your mind?" This was not a question. Lee had a quality of reading people that Chuck had noticed from the first hour they had spent together. Not the performance of reading people, not the affectation of perception, but the actual real-time reception of information that most people filtered out before it reached their awareness. It was one of the things Chuck had been thinking about in the context of his own practice for 2 years. "I want to talk about something before we train," Chuck said. "Then talk," Lee said. He sat on the edge of the concrete pad, cross-legged, with the ease of a body that had been conditioned to find rest in positions that were not conventionally comfortable. Chuck sat across from him. The morning light was coming over the east fence now, the specific quality of California autumn morning light that had no weight to it, clean and direct and not yet warm. In the yard next door, something, a dog, a child, some domestic animal, was making a periodic sound of indefinite content. "I've been thinking about why we disagree," Chuck said, "about tradition, about what a practitioner owes to the system that formed them." "I know what you think," Lee said. "You've said it. I know, but I want to say something that's underneath the position. The reason I hold the position." Lee looked at him with the quality of listening that was his. It was a specific quality. He did not perform listening, did not arrange his face into the expression of someone attending. He simply received. Part 2. The argument they had been having, the argument between them, which had been running in various forms for 2 years, was about the nature of debt. Chuck's position, which he had been developing since the conversation with Park Sung-jin in Osan in 1959, through the Air Force training, through the first years of competition, into the present, was that a practitioner owed their tradition a form of fidelity. Not uncritical fidelity, not the fidelity of someone who reproduces without examining, but fidelity in the sense of honoring what had been received by transmitting it honestly, by not claiming that what you had constructed from your tradition was the same thing as the tradition itself, by maintaining the distinction between the received thing and the thing you made from it. Lee's position was the opposite, or at least occupied the opposite end of the spectrum. He argued that tradition was a starting point, not a destination, that the obligation of the serious practitioner was not to the tradition, but to the principle the tradition was in service of, and that when tradition and principle diverged, the principle took precedence. He had built Jeet Kune Do from this argument. He was, by the autumn of 1969, the most visible exponent of the position that a martial artist's primary allegiance was to effectiveness rather than lineage. They had argued about this on most of the Thursday mornings of the 2 years they had trained together. The argument had been productive in the way that arguments between serious people with complementary blind spots are productive. Each position clarified the other's weaknesses. Each challenge produced a more refined response. On this October morning, Chuck wanted to say what was underneath his position. "I grew up without a father," he said. "My father was present and then he wasn't, and the things I learned from people after my father, from Park Sang-jin, from the instructors at March, from the tournament circuit, those things were given to me with an intention that I understood, even when it wasn't stated as, 'Carry this forward, don't just use it, carry it.'" Lee listened. "My position on tradition is not philosophical," Chuck said. "It's personal. When I say a practitioner owes something to the lineage that formed them, I'm saying the people who taught me gave me something that cost them something. They gave it because they believed I would be a good carrier, not a perfect replica, a carrier, someone who would take it further rather than just taking it." Lee was quiet for a moment. "And my position," he said carefully, "is that what they gave you was not the form. It was the aspiration the form was trying to express. The debt you owe is to the aspiration, not the container." "Yes," Chuck said, "I know. Those aren't incompatible," Lee said. "I know that too," Chuck said. "I've known it for a while, but we've been arguing as though they are." Lee looked at him with the specific quality of someone reassessing a position, not because they've been defeated, but because a new formulation has illuminated something they hadn't previously seen clearly. "Why are you saying this now?" he said. "Because you're leaving," Chuck said. The morning light had moved over the fence and was now crossing the concrete pad, reaching the edge of the tool shed. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a car started and drove away. Part 3, Hong Kong. Lee had been offered a deal by Raymond Chow and Golden Harvest, the Hong Kong production company, to make a series of films in Hong Kong. The films that would become The Big Boss and Fist of Fury, and the beginning of the cultural phenomenon that was, in 1969, not yet visible in its full dimensions, but that Lee had a specific and confident sense of as an approaching reality. He was leaving California in the spring of 1970. He had told Chuck 2 months earlier, without ceremony, the way he told things that were true and significant, but that didn't require performance. "I'm going to Hong Kong." Chuck had received this without visible response, the way you receive things whose full weight you're not ready to process in the moment of receiving them. He had said, "When?" and Lee had said, "Spring," and they had gone back to training. Now it was October. Spring was not many months away. "You'll come back," Chuck said. "Of course," Lee said. It's a film project, not a permanent relocation." He paused. "But it's a significant commitment. And the training," he gestured at the yard, "this becomes what it's always been, which is something I do alone, or with the students." The students were the small group Lee maintained at his school on Wilshire, the serious ones, the ones who had come for the specific thing Lee was developing, rather than for the general practice of a martial art. Dan Inosanto, Richard Bustillo, the dedicated few. Chuck was not one of Lee's students. That was an important distinction that both of them had maintained throughout the 2 years. Chuck was not a student. Lee was not an instructor. They were practitioners working on the same problem, whose sessions together had the character of collaboration rather than teaching. The distinction mattered because it had produced a quality of exchange that the teacher-student relationship would have foreclosed: genuine disagreement, genuine challenge, the kind of honest intellectual friction that is only possible between people of comparable standing. "What I'm going to miss," Chuck said, is the argument. Lee looked at him. Then he said, with the directness that was one of his most consistent qualities, "What will you argue with?" "The position itself," Chuck said. "Your position. Without you here to push back against it, I'm going to have to argue against it myself, which means I'll have to understand it better than I do." "That's the purpose of any serious argument," Lee said. "The best outcome is that you understand the opposing position well enough to argue it yourself." "I'm not there yet," Chuck said. "No," Lee agreed, "but you're closer than you were 2 years ago." Part 4, the last session. They trained for 3 hours. Not a special session in its content. The same work they always did, the same mixture of sparring and form work, and the collaborative exploration of specific techniques that both of them were still developing. Lee was working on the high kicks that had become the most visible marker of the evolution in his practice. The kicks that Chuck had argued for, and that Lee had initially resisted, and that had, over the 18 months since the argument, become among the most recognizable elements of Lee's repertoire. Chuck watched him use them now, with the specific quality of attention he brought to things he had had a hand in shaping. Not pride exactly. The kicks were not his, they were Lee's, and what Lee had done with them was distinctive enough, from what Chuck had shown him, that the lineage was more of an original suggestion than an ongoing influence. But something adjacent to pride, the recognition of a contribution, however small, in the development of something that was clearly going to matter beyond the backyard in Culver City where it had been refined. They sparred. The sparring between them had always had a particular quality, not competition because neither of them was trying to win, but not drill either, because the movement was too real and too responsive to be structured. It was closer to conversation in the sense that it required genuine listening and genuine response and could not be faked without the other person knowing it immediately. Lee was faster than Chuck. He had always been faster, the hand speed especially, which was a physical quality that training could improve but could not create from nothing, and that Lee had been given at birth in the specific calibration of rare. In the sparring, Chuck compensated for this not with speed of his own, but with the particular quality of reading that was his native strength, the ability to be slightly ahead of the movement, to understand what was coming from the information that preceded it, to be in the position rather than moving to the position. They went for 40 minutes, which was longer than usual, without discussing the extension. The morning light had moved to afternoon light without either of them noticing the transition. They stopped by mutual and wordless acknowledgement and stood in the center of the pad, both of them breathing harder than the casual observer would have expected. Lee looked at Chuck with the specific quality that Chuck had learned to read as his version of genuine feeling, not performed, not indicated by the usual social signals, but present in the eyes and in the stillness of the face, the emotion expressing itself through the precision of the attention rather than through any of the conventional signs. "You're better than you were when we started," Lee said. "So are you," Chuck said. "The kicks," Lee said. It was its own complete sentence, referencing the argument without requoting it. "The kicks," Chuck agreed. They stood in the afternoon light that was not quite the same as the morning light, but was the same yard, the same concrete, the same fence and tool shed and suburban California autumn in Culver City. They had been here 300 times in 2 years. They would not be here again, at least not in this configuration, with this specific quality of productive opposition that the collaboration had produced. Part 5. What Lee said before Chuck left. After the session, they sat against the tool shed in the shade it cast. The same position they took at the end of most sessions, the body's need for stillness after sustained effort, finding the nearest available support. Lee said, "I want to say something." Chuck waited. "You have been the most useful disagreement I have found in this practice," Lee said. "Not the most skilled opponent in sparring. There are people faster. Not the deepest technical knowledge. There are people who know more. But the most useful disagreement." He paused. Because you held your position with enough conviction and enough intelligence that I had to actually develop my own position rather than just assert it. That is rare. Chuck looked at the fence, at the late afternoon light on the top boards of it. You held yours, he said. Not as well as you held mine, Lee said. I am better at making a case for my position than for the opposing one. You understand my position better than I understand yours. That's because your position is easier to understand, Chuck said. The principle takes precedence over the tradition. That's clean. My position is messier. It requires holding two things simultaneously. Yes, Lee said, which is why it's harder and probably why it's right. He paused. Not entirely, but more right than I've been willing to say in the argument. Chuck looked at him. Are you conceding something? Not in the argument, Lee said. The argument continues, but he was choosing his words with the care he brought to things he wanted to say accurately. I want you to understand that the 2 years have not been one-sided, not philosophically, not in the sparring. He paused. You showed me the high kicks, but you also showed me something else, the quality of receiving a challenge without immediately countering it, holding the challenge, sitting with the discomfort of not knowing before moving to a response. He looked at Chuck. I still counter too fast. It is a limitation I am aware of and have not fully corrected. I know, Chuck said. You are slower to respond, but your responses are better, Lee said. That is a different skill from speed. It is perhaps a harder skill. They sat in the afternoon shade. What are you going to do with it? Lee said. The practice. After. Keep teaching, Chuck said. Keep competing for as long as there's something to compete for. Build the school. He paused. Try to figure out what the argument is without you here to argue against. Lee was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that Chuck would carry forward for a very long time, not as a maxim but as a practical instruction. The question you should be asking your students is not, what do I know? The question is, what does this person need to know? And what do I know that corresponds to that need? He paused. Teaching from knowledge is common. Teaching from correspondence, matching what you know to what the student actually needs, is the art. He looked at Chuck. You have the art. You've had it since the beginning. You don't always trust it. I know, Chuck said. Trust it, Lee said. Whatever else changes, trust that. Part 6. The Walk to the Gate. Chuck left at 5 o'clock, which was later than usual. They walked across the yard together to the gate at the back of the property. The gate that opened onto the alley that connected to the street. The same gate Chuck had come through 300 times. The yard looked different in this light. The late afternoon low and particular, the concrete pad casting its own shadow. At the gate, Lee stopped. You will come and see me, he said, in Hong Kong. Yes, Chuck said. And we will continue the argument, Lee said, by letter if necessary, by whatever means. By whatever means, Chuck agreed. Lee looked at him with the full version of his attention, not the training attention which was functional and specific, but the other version, the one Chuck associated with the conversations after sessions, the quality of genuine regard that was not performed and not occasional, but that had been present in the relationship from the beginning as a kind of ground condition. You are a good practitioner, Lee said, which means you are honest about what you don't know, and you stay in the work with what you do know, and you continue. That's not common. Chuck looked at the gate, at the alley beyond it, at the ordinary California street visible at the alley's end. You're better than me, Chuck said. In some ways, Lee said, not all. And the ways in which you are better, he paused, they will matter more in the long run. Chuck opened the gate and went out. He drove back to Torrance in the fading October light, through the ordinary traffic of the late afternoon, thinking about the conversation and about Hong Kong and about the argument and about what it would mean to hold his side of it without Lee's side to argue against. He taught the next morning's class at 5 o'clock. He taught it with the specific quality of correspondence that Lee had described, not teaching from what he knew, but matching what he knew to what each student needed. He had been doing this for years without a name for it. Now he had Lee's name for it. Lee left for Hong Kong in the spring of 1970. Ni plodascac. Not many, neither of them was a particularly natural correspondent, and the distance and the demands of their respective work meant that months passed between letters. But the letters that came were the kind that mattered, specific, substantive, carrying the argument forward in the only medium available to it. The last letter Chuck received was dated March 1973. It was about a project Lee was developing, a film he was writing that would be different from the others, more personal, more philosophically explicit. He described its premise in outline. It sounded extraordinary. It was not going to be made. Bruce Lee died in July 1973 in Hong Kong at 32 years old. The argument ended without resolution, which is what good arguments do. They don't end with one side winning. They end with both sides having been developed beyond what either side would have been without the other. They end when one of the participants is no longer available to continue. And what remains is not the unresolved question, but the changed practitioner who has spent time in its company. Chuck kept his side of the argument, not by defending the position unchanged. That would have been the wrong kind of fidelity, the kind that honors the form of a thing at the expense of its content. He kept it by continuing to examine it, to develop it, to apply it to his teaching and his developing system and the specific questions that each year brought. He kept the question alive because the question was what the argument had given him, not the answer, the question. The ongoing, irresolvable, productive question of what a practitioner owes to what has been given to them, and how they honor that debt by what they become. The last sparring session in the Culver City backyard had ended at 5 o'clock on an October afternoon in 1969, with Chuck walking through a gate into an alley and driving home through the ordinary traffic. The session had never quite ended. Some things don't.